Well, welcome 930 Church. It's good to see you. It's good to be here today. I'm hoping this preaching business is kind of like riding a bike, because it's been a while since I've been in the saddle. But I'm excited to be preaching on this series in the book of James, a study of faith and life, because James really is one of the most practical books in Scripture. If you open it up to James chapter 1, take a look at the introduction, the page before, you'll see that the introduction says just that. You'll find that on page 1741. And right at the very top of the introduction, it says, if you're looking for practical ways to live as a Christian, you've come to the right book. James shows it's possible to believe the right things, yet to live the wrong way. And if you look at the very bottom of the introduction, the last sentence, it says, don't look for pious platitudes here, but expect a string of hard-hitting, specific, practical instructions to help you live an authentic Christian life. And if you take a look right above that paragraph there, when was it written? Isn't it interesting to note that James may have been one of the first New Testament books to be written? I love what Andy Stanley says about the book of James. He says, think about it. This may be the definitive proof that Jesus was the Son of God. If Jesus' own brother came to believe that he was the Son of God, that should probably be enough for the rest of us, don't you think? Derek did a really excellent job last week with chapter 1, and you'll notice in chapter 1, in case you weren't with us, that James begins by tackling a very tough subject at the very beginning of the book. Take a look at chapter 1 once again, and you can see that the title is Trials and Temptations. We were talking just the other day as a staff about how many trials and tribulations we've had here at Faith Community this summer with unexpected deaths of family members and young adults, of car accidents, of cancer diagnoses. We've had a wave of surgeries here at Faith Community this last month like I have never seen before. So what in the world does James have to say about handling trials and tribulations? Well, the truth of the matter is he spins it maybe the opposite direction of what we might expect. In verse 2, he says, consider it pure joy. What? Consider it pure joy? You got to be kidding me. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Why? Because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. How about that? Well, I can assure you that if you were to come into my office or Eric's office or Derek's office this week and you were to share with us some struggle that you're going through, some hard time, the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one, we're probably not going to respond by saying, rejoice! Because that wouldn't be very sensitive, would it? But here's the deal. You and I can prepare today for the suffering that might come tomorrow by remembering that suffering can lead to joy. Think of some examples in your own life of how suffering does lead to joy sometimes. Think of suffering through school, if you will, suffering through studies and suffering through tests, to the joy of getting a good grade, perhaps, or the joy of eventually having a good education, the joy of getting a good job. The Broncos have been kind of suffering through some preseason trials and tests that has led to the joy of winning their first preseason game and hopefully the joy of winning a lot more games this season. We had a memorial service for my father-in-law this last Wednesday morning. I can't believe that the first to be in our new columbarium are my in-laws, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law. But as hard as it is to say goodbye to Ray, and as hard it is to say goodbye to Marilyn, there is joy in knowing that they're with the Lord. And there was joy in gathering together with family and friends this last week. Make no mistake about it, eventually, each one of us is going to go through hard times. Each one of us is going to go through struggles and suffering. So James here wisely reminds us that to remember that suffering can lead to joy. And as chapter 1 continued last week, you also noticed that James tackles the subject of listening. And there's a very, very practical subject, the subject of listening, as he says, remember this, my dear friends, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. How's that for good practical advice? I mean, if we all just worked on this, wouldn't our lives instantly improve? Learning to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Wouldn't our marriages immediately improve? Wouldn't our relationship with our kids immediately improve? Wouldn't our relationships at work immediately improve? Our relationships with our neighbors, if we learn to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. This last week, with lots of relatives in town, of course, a lot of stories being shared, reminiscing. And Cindy at one point was lamenting that sometimes in tense situations, she tends to be a slow processor and that she isn't always super quick to think on her feet. But you know what? James would commend that. James would commend that when we are slow to speak and slow to anger. This last week as a staff, we were at a satellite conference up in Loveland at Crossroads Church. And one of the speakers we heard by way of satellite was Colin Powell, who shared with us that as a world leader, he found it to be invaluable learning to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger in tense situations. As a staff, the last 2 Tuesdays, we've been doing we've been learning about active listening, because we believe that as a staff, we can better serve one another the more we learn to listen. I've had a lot of weddings this last summer, and I got a number of weddings coming up this fall as well. And one of the things that I often talk about in wedding sermons and in premarital counseling is the power of listening and the value of listening. It's so amazing how good we are at listening at the very beginning of a relationship. I mean, we lean forward and we pay attention to every detail. We hang on every sentence. But then as life goes on, as the relationship goes on, sometimes our listening skills get worse and worse and worse. James gives us such helpful advice here. If we just did this, our lives would improve. Learning to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. So as we take a look at chapter 2 here, the practical advice continues. Now he's specifically addressing the church. Take a look at chapter 2. Favoritism forbidden. And let's pick up the story with verses 2 and 3. Where James says this, and let's read verses 2 and 3 of chapter 2 together. It's found on page 1743. With verses 2 and 3, James says this. Let's read it. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, "Here is a good seat for you," but say to the poor man, "You stand there," or "Sit on the floor by my feet." And he goes on to say, "Have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" In other words, James is reminding us here that we are called to show hospitality to everyone. To show hospitality to everyone. You know what? Every church I know claims to be a friendly church. But the question is, who are we friendly to? So do you suppose that this kind of favoritism is a problem in the church today? You know, where people seat? I don't know if that's a big problem in the Lutheran church, because after all, we're Lutherans. And you know what? Lutherans tend to favor the back row. So go figure. My wife is a case in point. She's one of those Lutherans that tends to favor the back row. And so she freezes in the back row every week, because that's the coldest seats in the back row. So I say, "Well, why do you always sit in the back row if you're freezing all the time?" She says, "Well, because I might have to go to the bathroom." And I said, "Well, why do you drink so much coffee then on Sunday mornings?" And she says, "Because I'm a Lutheran." See, it all makes perfect sense to her. No, I don't think probably we tend to show favoritism with seating in the Lutheran church so much. But there's another kind of favoritism that I think is maybe killing the church in America today. And that is when we simply favor our friends with our attention on Sunday morning and we ignore others whom we haven't met before. Hey, by the way, just want to say a special welcome to Eric's parents, by the way. They're here this week and next week. And then also I got a chance to meet and greet a little bit before the service. Said Deb's back with us today. Deb, it's good to have you with us. And then also Curtis and Kim and Marcus are with us here this morning. So it's good to have you with us here today. It is important that we learn as a church to reach out to those we maybe haven't met before. Last week, I was with my buddy Bob Ritson. A lot of you know Bob Ritson from First Lutheran originally. Bob and I went back for our 40th high school reunion last weekend in Fremont, Nebraska, and we had a blast. Maybe you've seen some of our pictures on Facebook. But one of my classmates, and she was in my confirmation class, I won't tell you how many years ago that was, 40, 50 years ago, probably 45 years ago maybe. She's in a wheelchair now. And I really enjoyed visiting with her, and several of us visited with her, and her picture is up on one of my Facebook pictures. But I think, sadly, for much of the reunion, she felt invisible. Have you ever been someplace where you felt invisible? If more people would have simply been willing to break away from their conversations with their best friends and been willing to walk over and just visit with her, I'm sure that would have made all the difference in the world for how she felt about the reunion. I'm guessing maybe 25% of my class was there, class of 400 plus, and so about 100 of us there. And I wonder, for the 75 that didn't come to the reunion, I wonder how many didn't come because they felt, I'd just probably feel invisible. Do you think? And I wonder how many of those same 75% maybe felt invisible in high school. We don't have many kids in this service because most are in Sunday school, but I wonder how many kids in school today, day after day, they feel invisible. Nobody talks to them in the lunchroom. Nobody talks to them. They feel like they're invisible. Yes, we are called to show hospitality to everyone. We're called to show hospitality to everyone. I visited a lot of churches through the years on vacations and things. And I told you about that one summer years ago where I visited 12 Lutheran churches over the course of the summer. And with those 12 Lutheran churches, there was only one person at one church at Lord of the Hills Lutheran in Dillon, Lord of the Mountain, that said hi to me all summer long. 12 churches. And I'm a pretty friendly guy. One person at one church reached out and said hi to me. You know why? Because everybody else was just having a grand old time chatting with their church friends. Well, that's not right. That's not right. We think what grows churches is great preaching and great music and great programs and great buildings. But you know what? I think if we would learn to fix this one thing, more Lutheran churches would begin to grow. Well, we learned this last week at this conference that you got to do more than inspire people, motivate people. You got to encourage them to practice, practice, practice. And hospitality takes practice, doesn't it? And it takes some courage to practice hospitality. So if somebody finds the courage to come up to you and to introduce themselves and they ask if you're new here, please, 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 please don't say, well, I've only been a member here 20 years. Because then they're going to feel dumb. That's not kind. Don't do that. Don't do that. Even if that's true, don't do that. And if somebody finds the courage to come up to you and say, are you new here? Don't, or have I don't think I've met you before. Don't say, well, we've only met about 5 times. Don't do that. Don't. It might be true, but don't do that. Don't do that. And don't do this either by way of practice. Don't say, remember me? You know what happens when people do that to me? When people come up to me and they say, remember me? My brain freezes. It just freezes. It locks up. Anybody else had that happen before? Brain locks up. So don't do that. Remember me. But if somebody does say that and they say, remember me, don't retaliate by making a joke of it. I've seen that too, where people say, I don't have any idea who you are. That's not nice either. So let's just be kind and gracious to one another. Help me remember your name. Help me remember your name. I can't recall if we've met before or not. Help me remember your name. Because James reminds us here we are called to show hospitality to everyone. Since your Bibles are open, it's so wonderful that everybody's Bibles are open. Because if you just turn them back 2 pages to Hebrews 13, I love what the book of Hebrews has to say about this on page 1739, concluding exhortations in verses 1 and 2, Hebrews 13. It says, keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers. For by so doing, some have entertained angels without knowing it. I wonder how many angels get ignored in churches all across the country every single Sunday morning because we're so busy being friendly and chatty with our friends. I love that we have friends in church. Don't get me wrong. But let's be alert. Let's be alert to show hospitality to everyone. Well, James goes on then here in the second half of the chapter talking about faith and deeds. And so let's pick it up. Again, he gives another illustration. Let's pick it up with verses 15 and 16, where he says this. Let's read it together. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well-fed, but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? And he goes on to say in verse 17, those famous words, in the same way faith by itself is not accompanied by action is dead. In other words, James is encouraging us to remember that we are called to walk the talk. How important is that? That we are encouraged to walk the talk. If you haven't taken a look at the bulletin devotion, why don't you do that right now? Take a look at the bulletin devotion at the very beginning of your bulletin. Christy Martinez did a beautiful job of describing how the book of James was really kind of a struggle for Martin Luther. I mean, he actually referred to the book of James as a book of straw. Now, why in the world would he do that? Well, it makes sense given the history where Martin Luther was living in a day where he was battling the church that in that day was teaching that you could work your way into heaven and that grace alone was not enough for salvation. So for Martin Luther, it was hard for him to hear James say faith without works is dead, because he believed with all his heart that we are saved by grace alone. But you see, James is coming along at a totally different time. James is coming along at a very, very early time in the baby church, and we can easily imagine that he was dealing with just the opposite problem. That to a baby church that was just now hearing for the first time about grace alone, that you don't have to work your way into heaven. You can't work your way into heaven. Grace alone saves us. There were people that were beginning to say, oh, that's awesome, that's cool. I can keep on sinning that grace may abound. No, Paul addresses that. No, by no means. Paul says in Romans 6:2, we have died to sin. To keep on sinning that grace may abound is to slap God in the face. That's not the point here. The point here is that we are called to walk the talk. And of course, Jesus said the same thing. He said, by their fruit you shall know them. James is addressing the problem of phony faith. Have you ever seen phony faith before? I think we've all seen phony faith before. Where people say one thing and they do something completely, totally different. Where Christians act one way in church on Sunday morning or on the weekends, but they act totally different once they get out to the car or once they get home or once they get to work the next day. James is addressing the problem of phony faith. So he reminds us wisely that we are called to walk the talk. Those of you that are on Facebook maybe noticed the story that Derek posted about 10 days ago. It's a story about a pastor who was called to be the brand new senior pastor of a huge megachurch. Huge megachurch. So the very first Sunday, before he'd been introduced, he came and he disguised himself as a homeless person, just to see how the congregation would react. And sure enough, people were kind of uncomfortable, looked the other way. They avoided him. He made his way down to the front row of the church. And in that particular case, they asked him if he could move to the back. And so it was a very, very awkward moment. And by the way, we're thankful that Eric and Derek didn't do that on their first Sunday here. That would have been very, very awkward. It was a very, very awkward in this story there, but a very, very memorable moment when the senior pastor was introduced. And he stood up and began to read to them from Matthew 25, Jesus' words, "Where were you when I was hungry, and when I was thirsty, and when I was naked, and when I was in prison? Where were you? For whatever you do to the least of these, you do also to me." How many of you have heard of Mahatma Gandhi? Mahatma Gandhi once said he'd probably have become a Christian if not for the Christians he met. Ouch. Do you think there's people today that would say the same thing? I'm afraid there probably are people in the United States who would say, I'd have become a Christian except for those that I met. So that's what James is talking about here, that we are called to walk the talk. The good news of Jesus Christ, of course, is that God so loved the world and that God first loved us. But in response to that good news, may we be bold and may we be courageous and may we be generous in sharing that love with others. Let's pray.